Important 10 years at Yale.
I, as you guys know, went to Yale for the School of Art.
I originally made this work when I was at Yale in my second year in 2002.
I never heard of Yale School of Art until Kehinde Wiley, and I went to an exhibition of his work in 2005 at Deitch Projects, and then that's when I saw his resume, I saw that, and I was like, what's that?
The exhibition looks at a transformative period in contemporary art history, focusing on a generation of artists who attended Yale University Art School for their graduate studies.
In my work, I like to focus on representations of the non-white female body, in particular black and brown bodies, and the perceptions and the stereotypes that tend to come with being black or brown. So I do this primarily by using symbolic imagery. I use different symbols to create different layers of meaning. I use a combination of symbols that are both direct symbols, things like the Trojan box. This could be a very, very good contemporary symbol for sexuality. But then I also use what are known as associative symbols, things like just trash. If you see a beautiful woman and she's surrounded by trash, you immediately will start making the association of this person being like trash, being disposable, being an entity to be maybe used and tossed aside.
Humor is a really big part of my work. I feel like there's so many things about being an artist that's just so absurd. The American experience and the Japanese experience is a really kind of a clash, and that it's not an easy negotiation, and it never has been. So essentially, I make work because I'm constantly rehearsing that meeting of two completely different things, and like the kind of like, whether it's like surgical or like violent, or like that it's not, they don't blend into each other, that they're very distinct things. And so each of these pieces have these moments where two totally different materials collide, and that I think those are the parts where I most pay attention to and so all the work really has to do with that, but I don't know that if I would call that like the subject.
It's called The Changing Room because I kind of was thinking about a changing room, like a dressing room. Really, to talk about this body of work and what I'm doing, it's kind of just talking about painting a little bit. I was coming from the background of like an abstract painter, right? And so like, when you take something and you abstract it, like if there's something there and you abstract it, there's like this, I noticed there's this funny layer, there's filter between like what the thing is and what it is now. And if you abstract it again, it's like another layer. And so painting in that way, there's always this degree of like hermetics, this like kind of private language that happens between the artist and the work and the response to what's happening. And I sort of like the idea of what happens when you take abstraction and make it public, and like a public language that people have to interact with. Like it's, you know, when you put art out in a gallery, there are rules as to where it goes and how it can hang and what's going on here, and that creates a very different dynamic. And so the tension between like something public and something private was sort of driving all these architectural forms I was doing. You know, whether they're walls or hanging banners or panels, it's sort of about how do we interact with the space? Like how does your body interact with the space? And how do you take this private language and kind of make it public?
It's thinking about the kind of iconography that we as a country have used to think through this democratic project, right? Like, you know, the ancient Greeks were looking at the Egyptians, right? Or when the United States was being formed, it was looking at Rome, it was looking at Greece. And so thinking about how there's always a long look backwards in history to legitimize the present. And so the kind of iconography from the past is always being pumped into the present. And so thinking also in the ways in which these icons of the past, they're fully complicated beings, right? And so Libertas herself, like the Statue of Liberty, was the Roman goddess based off of a Greek goddess that emancipated slaves in Roman society. And so actually, Frederick Augustus, the sculptor of the Statue of Liberty, he meant that that statue would actually address the emancipation, the recent emancipation of Africans in bondage in this country. But that wasn't really, that wasn't really cool. The United States really didn't want that. They said, look, the Civil War is over. Do we still have to be talking about this? Yeah, we're gonna talk about it until there is no United States of America. We ain't never gonna stop talking about it. But anyway, like thinking about, so there is a chain that is underneath the foot of the Statue of Liberty. Originally, that chain was in her hand, so it was thinking about the broken bondage of these emancipated people. So in the kind of like press release and how the Statue of Liberty is even spoken about today, there is all of this intent that was lost over time, right? It ends up being this kind of complicated figure that is used to talk about whether people are welcome in the United States or not, right? Like it becomes like a kind of struggle point of immigration when it was actually originally about Black liberation. And so using that form or thinking through this idea of libertas, this is how these sculptures were born, and thinking through like how many different kinds of icons exist already in like our public squares and facades of buildings and marble, and thinking about classical sculpture, right? And how these things talk to us over time, and how kind of there's always this hypocrisy embedded within that, and there is always this complicated way in which we kind of are unsure of the kind of soft power that public art and sculpture has over us, right? Like, you walk by a particular sculpture 1,000 times a day in a park or over like the course of a lifetime, and you don't realize actually the kind of like soft power effect that is having on you psychologically, right? Like the way that you're thinking about the legitimacy of your government is in a particular way, and that is exercised through these public monuments. Yeah, so anybody got any questions?
When I created this piece, it was more about the idea, the conceptual idea behind it, rather than actually being a rocket ship. And so this was just a prop and a performance. And so I went through the ship and showed everyone how it worked. And so this is the piece that I read. When the natural resources of Earth start becoming scarce, many people will look towards the option of leaving this planet in hope of finding another planet that will sustain life. While most people will be in fancy, sophisticated NASA-type space shuttles, there will be people such as Indians who cannot afford such luxury and will have to build their own ships. These less complicated rocket ships will not be able to take off on their own and will have chains that hook on to the larger rocket ships. But one thing each of those shoddy rocket ships will have is an escape hatch in the floor. As all of the larger spaceships begin their countdown to take off, all the Indians will be slipping out of their escape hatches. The Indians will be putting their feet on the ground while everyone else is on their way out of here. So when I say these are fully working rocket ships, they are fully working rocket ships. But the whole intention of this piece is that it not only signifies this idea of kind of the biggest land back possibility, but also it replicates the relationship between tribal nations and the federal government. So there are certain things, we are nations within nations. We have political sovereignty from the US, but we're always tied and kind of under that rule of law at the very top of things. And so in that way, that's why we're creating our own rocket ships that are hooking on. And that's, to me, is that symbolic kind of gesture of being a nation within a nation. So within our own kind of complex, but always having that attachment to it. So there's a lot of political layers to this, even though it is like they are just rocket ships. And people are like, oh, but they'll burn up. Well, that's the thing is like the government's not going to tell us they're going to burn up. They'll be like, oh, very patronizing, and be like, oh, you little natives, go ahead and build your rocket ships. And they'd never tell us they were going to burn up. So they're meant to burn up. Like, I know this. They're going to burn up, and that's part of the process.
A lot of my history is about this idea of being on the periphery, a sort of a double consciousness, where I'm not Jamaican enough in Jamaica, I'm not American enough in America, I'm exoticized, which is kind of like weird, why am I exoticized? Anyway, and I am Shoshanna Weinberger, but I am not Jewish. So my whole experience has been this periphery, and sort of thinking about like Nella Larson's work, her writing about passing and being able to shape shift and be this nomad that can go in and out of space, but also dealing with the macro aggressions of, you don't look Jamaican. And I often say, well, what is a Jamaican supposed to look like? So it's a constant day-to-day sort of navigation. And I consider myself a visual anthropologist, cataloging these experiences through work and, thinking about myself almost as if these are specimens. The work always is in the frame, thinking about how women are objectified, thinking about female expose and presentation, especially how black and brown bodies have been portrayed. Thinking about history in that way too, and how the myth of the black body sort of projected into all of Western civilization. And so kind of using that and using my own body, these are all sort of self-portraits, but thinking about how my body is in space. And I think for a lot of women, we think about leaving the house, we think about where our bodies are in any given space. And so that's what these are. These are sort of excessive, unapologetic images of bodies, of female bodies. I wanted to sort of think about the idea of the grotesque, think about the idea of human form being human, animal, flipping back and forth from grotesque to beautiful, to sort of grand, and finding out and thinking about the idea of using color and how materiality and color make statements, create another voyeuristic transport. These are silhouettes, but they're not of any color. They're just a silhouette. If you stand behind a light, you don't know who's behind it. So it's really not necessarily about the specific colors, but about ambiguity and that excessiveness that comes from that, and that stems from me.